Okay, I think we're live. Who wants to start? Kayak?
You start.
No, you're supposed to. Okay, hello, I'm the new anime Rightist. This is the Anime Rightist YouTube channel. Today we're going to have a debate with the Blue Baron, who isn't here quite yet, but he will be here soon enough. And with me is the one, the only, the legendary Kayak. We don't have super chats yet, but at some point we may have them, and like at a certain number of super chats, he's going to tell you the legend of Kayak. Is that true?
Yes, I will tell you the legend of Kayak.
Yes, exactly. Anyways, you also wanted to do an intro.
Hello, this is Michael Lofton. Welcome to Reason and Theology Live.
All right, this is the worst thing. Yeah.
We might actually have the secret shadow lord who runs Reason and Theology from the back. Right, he might actually join the stream.
Which one of the shadow lords? We know all the shadow lords.
River.
Oh yeah. Damn, like I think we had like 5 viewers at first, and now we only have 3. See, we're like popular right now.
They're waiting for the Blue Baron. Also, make sure that we like keep this up on YouTube, so that it will like
all right.
So people will actually watch it.
Right, fair enough. Okay, how do I keep it up for YouTube?
You just don't delete it.
I have to admit I've never done. Okay, that's fair. So yeah, like before today's guest, the Blue Baron, arrives, what are we going to do? This is the most autistic stream.
So what have you been reading lately?
So I cannot read. Okay, that was a terrible joke. Well, what have I been reading lately? That's a good question.
Do you not know?
I started reading Wittgenstein's Tractus. I'm really not far into it. I think I've only read the introduction. That's pretty much it.
The Bertrand Russell's introduction? Or are you talking about like the preface?
Actually,
like,
who wrote the introduction? The preface, yeah, the preface.
Well, yeah.
Right,
the book itself gets pretty interesting if you're really attentive to it. I recommend memorizing the propositions.
Right.
Propositions 1 through 7.
I wasn't sure if I should just jump right into the book or if I should read Elizabeth Anscombe's introduction to the Tractus.
Oh, that book? Yeah. What you should do is you should read hers alongside the Tractatus.
Okay. That sounds like a plan. Otherwise,
also
I've
it
been
might get
lots of papers from. Sorry.
I recommend
more about Wittgenstein.
pulling up the Ramsey Ogden translation, because a lot, like, the literature is all in English, right? And the words that get translated, I'm not sure if they're that apparent, what they're like corresponding to in the text in German. So
I do have a German translation. Well, not translation. I do have the German version of the
the German translation.
Yeah, the German to German translation. Well, to be fair, like if we imagine translations to be like a kind of function that puts like, you know, you have input from one language and output from another, then technically you could have a German to German translation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, sort of related to tangentially Austrian to German translation, says Hanekawa Hoppe. Also, speaking of Hoppe, and tangentially related to tonight's debate, I read Hans Hermann Hoppe's. I think the book is called A Short History of Man, which was a decent book. What have you been reading lately, Kayak?
Let me pull this up. I've been reading Gilbert Ryle's Plato's Progress. It's a
All
book
right.
on. It gives like a very, 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 very different picture of Plato than Lloyd Garrison's. Also, a very, very different picture of Aristotle than well, at the beginning of the book than most people are used to. It's actually really well cited, and it gives a lot of evidence for the claims. It denies that. So basically, one of the things that it says is that instead of Aristotle being this like have this student of Plato who was extremely influenced by him, he basically just attended his lectures, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't much evidence that Aristotle was all that influenced by Plato. And a lot of his work, which supposedly was made after discussions with Plato, just wasn't. So it basically says that Aristotle was in many ways completely original. And it denies that Plato was a Platonist, right? Like that there's this thing called Platonism and that Plato held to it throughout all of his life. Rather that like the early, middle, and late dialogues are actually completely separate from each other.
That sounds interesting. Like, I obviously haven't read the book, but the case that Aristotle wasn't all that inspired by Plato, that seems like a compelling case, and I can see how that could work out. Seems like Trendy is joining us. Did you invite Trendy?
Yeah, let's get Trendy in.
All right, sure.
Yep.
Hello, Trendy, and welcome to the Blue Baron debate, which
Once he comes up,
which doesn't feature the Blue Baron just yet, but it will. Actually, isn't there like a novel?
What's up?
I forgot the name, even though it's like this sort of very
In the live stream here.
yeah, we're gonna be debating Blue Baron, defender of monarchy and traditionalism.
Is he
right?
does he believe in the essence of energy distinction?
We don't know. We could ask him.
We don't know. We don't know.
Does he have the news?
I think he's newsless.
Dumbox tell us.
Wait, I just got a DM by the real anime Rightist. So before the debate starts, which it will eventually, we should probably clarify that. So some of you probably have figured out since like the last video, the first video in the natural law series. I'm a new guy that anime Rightist gave this channel to. And Kayak is my co-host. I'm not the original anime Rightist. This should be said because he wanted to be absolutely sure that nobody is going to associate him with the position of classical liberalism.
Yeah, Surprise, surprise. He is not the anime rightist.
Yeah, the OG anime rightist, and I pros to say this, is not a classical liberal. In regards to the
I mean,
question
neither
of
are
whether or
you,
not,
but
how dare you, sir? No, I'm going to take this label with a sense of pride. In regards to the politics of the original anime rightist, I'm not going to say he's a Marxist, but I've never seen him and Karl Marx at the same place at the same time. That was a joke, by the way. He's not a Marxist either.
yeah. How do you know that you're not a caveman?
How do I know that? Then?
Have you
I'm
ever
not
been
a
at the
caveman.
same place at the same time as any caveman?
Actually, no. Perhaps I am a caveman.
Yeah.
How do you
The
know you're
logic
not a
works
dumb
out.
ox? A dumb Thomist.
He's a Suarezian.
That's irrelevant. It's not the Catholic position.
Well, what's meant by the Catholic position?
Thomism is dogmatized.
That's quite a hot take.
Read Denzinger, bro. Read Denzinger.
I've read it twice.
To be fair, like Danziger is like a fairly useful resource, at least on some issues.
It's the sources of Catholic dogma.
Yeah,
Right, he
although
wants to be added to the
Dyer
stream.
makes it out as if it was like this book that was written that like contains all the dogmas rather than just like a
Goodness,
copy
the
paste.
Blue Baron joined.
Yo!
Sorry it took so
Hello.
long. Had a few technical difficulties there.
We did it. Wait. First off, welcome. I'm just gonna invite one more guy, and then we can go. By the way, you're not going to debate all of these people. You're only going to debate me.
All right then.
Are you gonna put on your camera or something?
No, unfortunately.
What?
Oh, he's. Wait, why is he gone?
He just disappeared.
The Blue Baron vanished.
He was
This
sounding
is-
a bit off. Doesn't
I'm
sound like he
pretty
does
sure
in his
he
other
will
videos.
return.
I think he goes to Go Arch, bro. I think that's why.
Right. So the Blue Baron will hopefully return. This is actually kind of this is our first stream, and boy do you notice it. But anime rightist.
Can you guys hear me?
Yo!
Oh, cool.
Emmanuel
Awesome.
Kant.
Yeah, I'll just I just wanted to say hello. This is your first live stream, so it's like my kids all grown up.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I'm glad that you guys are doing
we're-
this discussion.
We're
and
having
I,
technical difficulties during the first live.
yeah, well, I don't want to be too cynical, but yeah, I hope the other guy wins. No, no, I hope it's.
Don't worry, the bets are set firmly against me. But
It's
I'm
libtarded
just joking.
Thomas.
I hope
also, I
it's a
think we've got.
discussion.
He just joined and left.
I think I told him to just leave and join again. This one is on me.
So basically, if I understand Frazzle's view, it's liberalism is great, but it just hasn't been tried yet, right?
Right. True
Real
liberalism
liberalism
has
hasn't been tried yet. Is that a good summary?
Yes, exactly.
You
That's
guys are
that's
up
how
to?
we're going to
Well,
phrase it.
his view,
Okay.
according to Hassan, is like it's like just like exactly like the other view, right? But he just puts the word classical liberalism or the label classical liberalism on it because he has an
Yeah, I think
emotional attachment to it.
Hassan's description is a bit unfair. And I think now we finally have the blue.
I think I figured out the problem. It said it couldn't access my devices and to close any other program that might be using them. I think I had to close Discord first.
Okay.
All right, well, welcome, Blue Baron. So I'm gonna wish you guys the best of luck. I was just here to say hello. Like I said, I'm retired now, so I can watch this, on my bed. I don't have to prepare show notes or anything. So good luck, guys.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So we can now start the debate proper after 16 minutes. Oh boy. So Blue Baron, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you. Hello, I'm the Blue Baron. I run a small YouTube channel. I do films and television reviews and outdoor adventure activities, and I try to look at the traditionalist and monarchist symbolism in classic media.
That's great. And so today we agreed to discuss or debate, however you want to call it, the question of traditional conservatism versus classical liberalism, with like a specific focus on the question. Did he leave again? Kayak?
He left. He's having internet issues, I think.
Yeah. Honestly, great that he joined us. Also great that the original anime writers joined us. This is the best debate stream, no doubt about it. Okay, let's add him again.
I'm experiencing
All right,
technical difficulties, as you can tell.
Right. Hanekawa Hoppe just said, I guess Anime Writers 2.0 wins by default, but no, you have returned. The match hasn't been settled yet. So, all right. So today we want to do debate or discuss classical liberalism and traditional conservatism under the specific question of which one is more conducive to human virtue. Is that right?
I believe that was the theme of the discussion, yes.
Exactly. So, do you want to start? I think you're going to take the position that traditional conservatism is more conducive to human virtue, all things considered.
Yes,
And
I
what's
would
the
take
case?
that position. All right. Well, this is going to be off the cuff. I didn't really have time to prepare anything, so I would say that traditional conservatism is more conducive to personal virtue for two reasons. One, traditional conservatism is inherently tied to, well, at least in the European conservative sphere, it's inherently tied to Christian morality, which itself is the most conducive thing to personal virtue. And the second reason is traditional conservatism focuses on the individual and how it relates to the government through individual. Well, if you want to really get technical, it's about a person serving as king and country, and that king being under God. And so it's all interconnected relationships, which I think helps to create virtue on a personal level.
All right. Thank you for your statement. I'm going to do this more or less off the cuff. So I'm going to take the position that classical liberalism is more conducive to human virtue, and my perspective is very much going to be that for for the acquisition of virtue, we do need freedom, both in the individual sense and in the social sense. What I mean by this is, on the one hand, that we sort of need an Actonian idea of freedom, the sort of like Lord Acton notion that freedom is essentially consists in the right to do what one, like freedom essentially consists in the notion that we do have. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous during debates.
That's
let's,
fine.
Let's try one more
I'm
time.
the same way.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially, the idea is that like we as human beings have certain duties to fulfill, certain moral duties, and in order to be able to fulfill these, we first of need to act in accordance with these duties freely, or otherwise they would not really count as virtue. And second of all, we need like freedom as a sort of protection of our ability to perform our duties, to do what is right. And the second way in which I do think that freedom is conducive to virtue is related to the idea that next to like freedom being an important and integral part of moral acts in and of themselves, or the question of kind of virtue ethics, and how next to the sort of theoretical aspect of virtue ethics, of what is right and what is wrong, there's also the practical aspect of virtue ethics. So let's say I set myself a goal which I deem to be good, then I need a means to obtain this goal. And this means will very much depend on practical experience, practical knowledge. And so really, in order to acquire virtue, personal knowledge is necessary. Now, this is an interesting point to make because, in my estimation, this sort of focus on personal and practical experience kind of gives you a certain picture of the individual, where every individual needs to be required, and this is more or less like a Hayekian point, needs to be required to be able to act upon their knowledge and what they know, and to use it to the best possible use. So I do think that these 2 points together kind of create an order, a sort of moral order in which freedom to pursue goals of one's own choosing freely with one's own knowledge is absolutely essential to live a virtuous life. And these freedoms need to be protected by rights, and that's pretty much one of the jobs of the political order. In fact, since these are sort of the foundation of moral action, you might even say this is also the foundational job of a political order, to protect these basic moral rights. All right, so this would be my case.
All right, and I would say there's a main thing I can sort of do a rebuttal to that on is you seem to equate classical liberalism inherently with freedom. And while there is a statement to be made with that, I could argue against that. I'm instead, I think, going to argue against the idea that freedom creates more moral virtue. In history, it has been demonstrated to us that the more personal freedoms a society has, the more that society has tended to has tended to move away from personal moral virtue. For example, once, let's see, what's a good example? Well, once certain, shall we say, certain sexual acts were destigmatized or legalized, they became far more commonplace. For perhaps a better example, well, actually, I suppose we could go right to the beginning, though this brings up another question. I don't know how far we want to get into this, but in the Garden of Eden, God allowed us the freedom to choose to eat the fruit of the tree of life. So there was freedom to that, but that freedom led to a world with less personal moral virtue. So I think that while virtue must be chosen, the more freedom you have to make that choice, the more likely it is that you'll choose something other than personal moral virtue. And again, sorry, this is all off the cuff. I haven't really prepared anything, so I know it sounds sort of slapped together.
All right, that's fine. I guess my basic response to this would be that first off, there seems to be like a conflation between two different points. On the one hand, yeah, it is true that with an increase of freedom, obviously it's not the case that the only choice that will be available is the choice to essentially choose the good. Obviously, some will not do what is good and avoid what is evil. Some will very much do what is evil and avoid what is good. That is sort of a tragic fact of human nature, especially when humans kind of have the freedom to do so. However, my point would have been simply that moral action simply does not really exist in the absence of freedom. So my point is less that freedom is ultimately this thing that we can maximize in order to maximize the input of moral freedom, and you will maximize the output of moral virtue. My point is more that, like, with freedom, we have a sort of basic necessity for moral virtue. And in regards to this, your reply seems to have been that, well, sure, some freedom is necessary for the choosing of moral virtue. However, it doesn't seem to be the fact that therefore more, like a political order that protects more liberties will lead to greater moral virtue. However, I would simply say in response to this that I don't necessarily think that this is something we're going to maximize. I do think that, like, every possible moral decision is combined with freedom insofar as the moral decision to make that decision or not to make it, and therefore we very much just have like a general environment of free choice that is necessary for virtue. The idea is more or less that, and again, I would kind of like to combine this with my sort of more practical argument, or my appeal to practical knowledge within the realm of virtue ethics, where we can see how both, on the one hand, the freedom to make decisions, and on the one hand, the freedom to use one's knowledge for ends chosen by oneself, in a sort of like, essentially the freedom to make decisions, to plan decisions, etc. This is not just something we will maximize, where we say, okay, we're going to create this greater realm of decisions versus this narrow realm of decisions. I think instead that the way we should best look at it is, okay, there is something involved in these decisions, and that's pretty much a person that has to make those decisions. So this person needs to have command over their own destiny and therefore over their own person. And obviously, since we're not just disembodied entities, we need other things that, in order to make our decisions, in other words, we need material goods to make these decisions. And I think most people who are like sort of familiar with classical rights theory, natural rights theory, kind of know where I'm going with this. I'm essentially suggesting that the way we would dish out freedom is not in degrees of freedom per choice, but we would essentially dish it out in terms of ownership over oneself and one's property. So that would pretty much be the domain of freedom. But beyond that, when it comes to like questions of virtue, I think within the classical liberal canon, there are different answers. You will find someone like Herbert Spencer, who is very much advocating for the most minimal of states. In fact, to the point where he called parliamentary democracy just a new Toryism. On the other hand, you will find people who are more inclined to agree with the idea that some input on, like fostering moral virtue among citizens by the state might be a positive thing. I think two examples for this would be on the more Protestant side of things, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and on the Catholic side of things, Erik von Kühnert-Leddihn. But yeah, like essentially my idea of freedom is not so much that it will automatically and on its own produce more moral virtue, but that it's a necessary component of all morally virtuous choices and ultimately of the virtuous life, and that we are essentially safeguarding the sphere of moral decision making and planning, not by like maximizing freedom in some abstract way, but by essentially granting dominion and thus property rights over one's own person and one's own property. All right.
All right. Well, I can definitely see your point there. However, I would then I do have another rebuttal I can say to that, because the idea of personal freedom, particularly as it regards to one's life, property, and assorted things like that, actually has just as much of a root in traditional conservatism. For example, if we go back to the trial and regicide of King Charles I of Great Britain, or at that time of England, Scotland, and Ireland, we note that in his trial, he defended himself often by stating that if the king himself could be put on trial, then no one was safe. That in defending his own right to rule his kingdom as his property, he was defending the right of every Englishman to that which is justly his own. For if property and rights can be taken away from the king, then no one is safe from having from that which is rightly their own taken away from them as well. And again, this is sort of off the cuff. I don't have it memorized, but there is just as much, I would say, of a strong tradition of, particularly as it regards to both life and property, in traditional conservatism, especially in English conservatism. There is somewhat of it if you go to the more mainland European route as well, but I think it's the strongest in English Toryism because of its foundational nature coming out of the English Civil War and of King Charles's statements and beliefs during his trial.
All right. First off, I would actually agree with you that there is a sense in which under traditional conservative orders, you do have like an already sort of establishment of these institutions of property rights. I think like versions of the rights to self-ownership kind of date back even to the Stoics, if you really want to trace it back. However, I think first off, there is something to be said about like traditional monarchical orders. In fact, it's sort of erroneous to think that classical liberalism only ever came out in support of republics. In fact, I just mentioned Erik von Kühnert-Leddihn, who was very much in favor of monarchical orders and would have cited the same points that you were citing. On the other hand, you also have someone like Benjamin Constant, who was also talking about the positives of something like a constitutional monarchical order. That being said, in regards to traditional conservatism and these rights, I think there sometimes has been a tendency in the past to very, very much not universalize certain rights and to instead understand them as privileges. And in fact, like a lot of rule was ruled by privilege. So essentially, I think that one of the great sort of wins of classical liberalism, so to speak, is the sort of introduction of the concept of rule of law. So the idea that, in fact, the idea would be that law itself is in a sense supreme. That law both provides the sort of framework for liberty, but also provides, in a sense, like clear and distinct rules that can be followed, so that rule won't be arbitrary and therefore ensures and safeguards freedom. And that under the rule of law, everyone has more or less equal rights of dominion, even though, like rights in property may vary in the sense that some may own more whilst others own less. But yeah, sorry, this is a bit. I too am doing this off the cuff, and as I said, I'm a bit nervous during debates. But yeah, my point would be more or less that traditional conservatism absolutely establishes some of these same rights, which would guarantee the freedom of man. There also is another aspect to this, in the sense that classical liberalism does have this great benefit of the rule of law and the universalization of these rights claims. And I think this universalization takes place to a much stronger degree under the classical liberal order than under the traditional conservative order. That would have been my point.
All right, that is a good follow-up. Let's see where to go from here. Well, I would say that there are certain rights which were universalized under a traditional conservative order. For example, now, this wasn't the case in all monarchies, of course. For example, in the Inca Empire, the Sapa Inca owned everything, including his people, and could take everything away as he pleased. But in European monarchism, particularly that which came out of the feudal era, it was well understood that every man was entitled to that which was rightfully his own, and no ruler could force it from him. Contracts could be made of one's own free will, but people could not be coerced forcefully out of that which was justly their own. There are, of course, there was also, I would think, now, when you talk about universalizing something, this is hard because traditional conservatism never really needed to codify anything, because it was a government that developed naturally, and as something that develops naturally and grows organically, it doesn't have a tendency to codify everything into written law. So things like a universal right to life wouldn't really have been written. However, it can easily be said that the universal idea of a right to life was more prevalent in the traditional conservatism of Europe than in the classical liberalism of one, at least in regards to how the Europe of today developed out of classical liberalism. And that's the same Europe which denies multiple people the right to life, denies people who are still inside the womb, denies people who are aged or infirmed or have serious mental disabilities or who are in a coma, or multiple other examples I could probably think of given enough time. Now, one could debate, and there is some debate on whether certain instances really are life, and there's a lot of argument over that, of course. I would take the side that it is, but one can easily recognize that these things would not have been seen as really an option in a traditional conservative form of government, precisely because of the more universal idea, if you will, of a right to life. It was universal not in the sense that it was codified in a written law, but in the sense that it was, in a sense, you could say, written on the hearts of everyone in traditional conservatism, because people at the time sort of just had that inherent understanding. And so with regards to both the rights of life and property, I would say there was a sort of universalness to them in a traditional conservatism, whereas there is in many ways less of a universalness of them in classical liberalism, even if they are codified into law. Codified into law is not really the same thing as universal, I would say. Not necessarily the same thing as universal.
All right. Thank you. I technically had something slightly different when I assert universalizability. What I had in mind more or less was something like the example. But first of all, I do agree that, again, these things existed in some form under traditional conservatism, and especially like medieval feudal orders had some definite advantage over later. I wouldn't deny that. However, I think we need to be a little careful, because on the one hand, if you look at classical liberalism and the exact context in which it arose, it very much arose sort of in a modern era, in part as a response to the advent of the absolute state. Because although obviously monarchical orders and feudal orders existed throughout the Middle Ages in a particular form, which was very much conducive to liberty, at least under certain respects, under the growing sort of absolute monarchies of the early modern age, and the idea of the sovereignty of principles and similar notions, you kind of have an order which suddenly kind of has a very sort of different setup in regards to authority compared to the medieval order. And so very much the classical liberal sort of reaction to that is very much understandable. In fact, like some liberals, like let's say Lord Acton, did to a certain extent kind of regard the liberal concept as a way to get back some of the liberties of the medieval era. In regards to the universalizability of rights, though, one of the things I had in mind as an example would be something like the right to feud, which in regards to the feud, you have like an interesting sort of medieval construct, especially sort of in the Germanic and like room, and the room that would later become sort of like Austrian, where essentially people would be able to resist unjust kings and unjust rulers. This is interesting on the one hand. On the other, from what I remember, these rights would often be somewhat restricted within medieval orders, and would often belong most of the time, if you look at feuding rights, there was the possibility of, obviously, you do have some cases, historically speaking, where individual okay, you do have some historical cases where individual feuds are started by non-nobles, or at least there is a chance that like a non-noble would be able to justly and according with the law engage in a feud against the lord, which is why even non-nobles after a trial could be forced to sign the feud, which would sort of be a manner of resolving the feud. At the same time, in practice, if you look at resistance rights and similar conceptions, there were very much cases in which they were more often, at least in some cases, they were sort of granted exclusively to nobles, which I think kind of limits the sort of like universalizability claims to a certain extent, at least for the traditional medieval order. So the sort of formal equality in regards to what can be done doesn't seem to exist in the medieval order quite in the same way as in the modern order. Also, in regards to the question of, well, what about the right to life? Well, as a Catholic, I would actually agree with the concept that the unborn have a right to life, obviously. So only to just add this. Anyways.
If you had any more, you with that,
Oh,
go
yeah,
ahead.
you can talk.
All right. First of all, I would agree with you that the idea of classical liberalism was sort of a reaction to the absolutism that became apparent in the earlier modern era, and that this absolutism was quite different, even under a monarchy, was quite different than the liberties present in a feudal monarchy, in the feudal monarchies of the medieval era, and also in a sense before that, because even under monarchies of antiquity, such as the Roman Empire, the ancient Egypt, and so on, there wasn't, in a sense, absolutism of the state in the same way as we would think of it in, say, France under King Louis XIV. Now, on the other hand, the absolutism that was embodied by King Louis XIV is actually less absolute than the power that the state has today. So, and that power came to be out of the classical liberalism, although you could say it developed more out of a neo-absolutism, but under a republican form of government. But by the same token, the state today has broader and more far-reaching powers than many of the most absolute monarchs in history ever dreamed of having. In some cases, even more so than even Hitler or Stalin had. Now, this, I suppose, is getting a bit off topic, but it does relate back to how classical liberalism can, in a sense, develop into a society with less individual freedoms than you would have had under even the absolutism of the traditional conservatism. And I'd love to continue for tonight, but it's unfortunately I only had until 8 p.m. and it's now 8:08. I have to get down to help the family with post-dinner preparations and things like that.
All right. Thank you for being here.
And thank you very much for having me. Sorry I couldn't stay longer. It's hard to find time to do streams with how busy I am at home.
Right, that's perfectly fair. So thanks again for joining us. By the way, I know it wouldn't be entirely fair to respond while you were away, but would you mind that, just for the audience while you're gone, I would sort of give a quick reply to this?
I suppose you can do that, yes. I'll probably be back on at some point. We can discuss more if we need to there. That seems fair enough, I suppose. But right now I'll have to head off. So do you mind if I just This is something I've heard other people doing on streams. Do you mind if I just show my channel a bit before I leave?
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
So as I've said before, everyone, my channel name is The Blue Baron. I do films, television reviews, look at it all through monarchist themes. I did one of my most popular reviews with regards to symbolism is a review of Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that actually shows the dwarfs and, in a sense, Snow White symbolized the German monarchy and German monarchists of the Second Reich era, while Queen Grimhilda, in a sense, symbolizes Hitler and National Socialism, or as I like to call them, the False Reich, which I honestly think Hitler would spin in his grave hearing. He would be insulted by that so much, and I find that very amusing. Even more so because it's true, but I'm getting off topic. Anyway, I have a lot of interesting stuff there, and I'm also building a World War I trench museum. I built a mock-up of that in my backyard, so you can check out 2 videos of that there. And hopefully within the next year, I'll get approval to build a full-scale model in the fields near my house. So that's something very interesting if you're interested in reenactment or in just history and things like World War I. And I think that's it for now. I'll have to go now, but thank you again for having me, and I wish you all a good night.
Take care. God bless.
God bless you as well.
All right. Before we're going to continue the conversation with Kayak and Trendy, I would just briefly like to say that in regards to the questions of absolutism, the modern state, etc., it's true that like the modern state has an enormous amount of unjustified power, but I do not really think that this power is an outcome of the classical liberal order. In fact, if anything, I would say that the state of the modern state, in a sense, is a sign of the classical liberals of the 18th and 19th century having lost. So that would pretty much be my take on this. And if you kind of read through the tradition, like especially with some of liberalism's late defenders like F.A. Hayek or the aforementioned Herbert Spencer, you will find a sort of stark criticism of the state and all its powers. And yeah, I think the Blue Barons comments, as agreeable as they were almost kind of reminiscent of another liberal thinker, namely the already mentioned Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. So anyways, Kayak. This was a terrible debate, wasn't it? I was way too nervous.
It wasn't that great. Yeah,
I know.
Blue Baron was being a bit consequentialist.
Yeah.
It really just seemed like his argument was, wow, this isn't his argument just seemed to be that like giving people freedoms was had bad consequences, so we shouldn't do it. But I don't think that that's at all a traditional idea. I think that this debate would have gone better if you would have made it focused on the rule of law.
That probably would have been a better idea, since, like, strictly historically speaking, that was sort of one of the main selling points of classical liberalism. So you're right in regards to this. I just kind of wanted to start with 2 of the principles that I think sort of tend to be most well established in a sort of, like there's a version of classical liberalism which is adhered to by someone like Lord Acton, which essentially starts out with like conception of liberty. We may ground this in some rights, and we're going to give it a certain position when it comes to goods in the political order. And that's kind of what I was attempting to do. But you're right, I probably should have focused a lot more on the rule of law.
Yeah, because that's really like the big thing, right, with that classical liberalism has going for it. And it's ultimately like the biggest problem with most reactionary ideologies, which try to replace the government, our current order. The problem is that if this were to happen, it if there was a complete replacement, it would just lead to like widespread corruption, like it did in every single instance that it was tried, which is it's just why revolutions don't really work.
Right. I do agree. Although, like something obviously can be said in defense of quasi-feudal orders. In fact, some
Yeah.
liberals do say things in defense of them.
Yeah. Although the thing with quasi feudal orders and all these things is that they only work, right, if they have some like tradition to them, right? And if there's some way you can unify it, and you still need strong rule of law. If you don't have a rule of law in a feudal society, then it ends up turning out into like it basically looks like Latin America, or Ancien regime France, or Spain during its mercantilist phase, right? And then it just withers away and dies because of all the infighting between different parties.
Oh yes, certainly. That is a problem.
Yeah. That's just why monarchism isn't going to work. Monarchism, it relies on tradition, right? That there's a tradition of monarchy. It doesn't work outside that. And neo-monarchism, just there's no like, how are you going to give America a monarchy if it doesn't have a tradition of monarchism?
Yeah, it seems to be like that's one of the problems with neo-monarchists. It kind of seems to be completely unrelated to the sort of like lived reality of American life and American political life. And so obviously, like one of the biggest sort of arguments for monarchism, its sort of like standpoint is particularly traditional, sort of just doesn't apply to like a big and important part of the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And yes, sorry, go ahead.
Ultimately, when you have a corrupt elite, it'll just be bad. Like everything will just be terrible. That's just how it always is. And what I see a lot of these people do is, so we have this like liberal government, right? And it's corrupt. So liberalism must be the problem. Like they make that sort of inference. But and then you'll see people attacking monarchism will make the same inference. Well, look at all these examples of these corrupt monarchies. If you have a corrupt monarchy, it's the end of the world. It's just when you have corruption, it's the end of the world. When you have corrupt elites, it's the end of the world for you. And what it means to lack corruption is for you to have rule of law, right?
Right.
Yeah. So if you were to like dispose with the elite, right, with some like Night of the Long Knives style like takeover coup d'etat, it wouldn't mean that you'd have just peace and liberty forever, right? You need actually you need a tradition of like laws which everybody is bound to, right? And are the real rulers of your country, right? The law needs to be in charge. And at like all these like absolute monarchism type stuff, that's just really it's a big problem.
Right. I think this is a point I probably should have come to in regards to the rule of law, because F.A. Hayek in his Law, Legislation and Liberty actually has a sort of brilliant point that if you look at many traditions of law, especially something like the common law tradition, it's essentially a tradition of what it was established in custom already. And if you believe that, like, custom kind of arises from the individual interactions of peoples within a society, then really the rule of law is a sort of manifestation of the sort of customs and decisions that are made by free individuals within that society. So really, in a sense, there's nothing sort of contrary to freedom when we look at a certain conception of the rule of law. It's in fact a sort of manifestation of liberty. I don't know what you would say about that, Kayak.
Yeah. If you don't have liberties, then the rule of law is in danger, right? Because liberties, they limit the power of individuals, right? And if you limit the power of individuals, the power vacuum that's left will be filled in by something else. And it should be filled in with the power of law, right? And liberalism
Yes.
also limits the power of collectives, right? In ideal circumstances. Yeah. So what you need, right, is you need a polity which is actually going to do something to corruption, right? You need like an organized mass. Yeah. And these things are all going to be necessary to have a functioning government. But like monarchism, right? Like absolute monarchism is just completely opposed to that. It's completely it basically makes the rule of law just completely unstable. Constitutional monarchism is fine, but constitutional monarchism is a liberal ideology.
Right. I think I already mentioned in the debate Benjamin Constant, who is one of the first sort of French liberals, and he was very notorious for at the end of his life, sort of rejecting the idea of republic, which he kind of regarded as a rule by a mass of people, right? Where he thought that something like a constitutional monarchy would actually be better at preserving the rule of law and thus liberty.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's. I'm going to interrupt because I think there needs to be some pushback. Also, that would just make it more entertaining. I think there's a lot of question begging.
Yeah.
A lot of question begging. But I want to start out with the sort of principle which was brought up, which is the rule of law. Do you think the law is greater than the lawgiver?
In what circumstances? Which laws and which lawgivers?
Well, the positive. You think positive law is greater than who dispenses the positive law?
And by greater than, do you mean like has power over?
Well, I suppose yes.
Well, that's just, it's the definition of law. The lawgiver can't just like randomly override laws which bound the like regulate what they're doing, right?
Right. Well, I guess that would be one of the first things we would disagree with. I think the lawgiver is absolutely greater than the law which he dispenses. Otherwise, you have something like the Iranian Shahs who would write decrees and then just couldn't reverse them. Right. But he's the sovereign. Well, and this also leads to liberal positivism, wherein the state just creates its own version of law that subverts natural law, divine law, eternal law. So, for example, here in the United States, at least, the Supreme Court has actively denied natural law, has embraced legal positivism and has declared gay marriage a right. Well, upon what basis, right?
Well, we're saying that in some ways the natural laws are also going to be what the state is bound to.
Okay, but if I could give a sort of analogy of how this works, it's not merely natural, it's also supernatural, right? So there's the famous example in the scriptures of Jacob's ladder. You have a chain of being, and this is something that all the philosophers recognize, the chain of being. And essentially what you do with liberalism is you invert this chain of being, which is why you have in the liberal spheres, you either have something like Mazzini, where you have this sort of revelatory act within revolution, or you have pure naturalism, like with the Masons. I don't think there's any way to get around this when you embrace this ideology.
I would quickly like to return to the point on the rule of law, and especially since you were saying, well, in this case, we would just establish sort of positive law, which then would be greater than the natural law, and would, in a sense, like subvert the sort of natural order of things. And I do not think that's necessarily the case, especially since I do not really see a way in which this wouldn't just also be the case with like the rule of like an absolute monarchist or like a dictator. Like you could conceive of situations like this where you would also just via legislation kind of have a legal positivism which would run contrary to the natural law. In fact, you can kind of see that in some of the worst examples of dictatorship. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the positive law itself, we could easily have a sort of understanding of the positive law which runs in congruence with the natural law. And then there's still the fact that like you will even have theologians within our own tradition who will defend such a notion of the law. As an example, Suarez was very much of the opinion that like positive law, although in a sense dependent on the natural law, insofar as it shouldn't command things that are contrary to it, is also a manifestation of custom. It is something that is that reflects the behaviors of the people, if you will.
Right. Well, I want to make two distinctions. Nuance it up a bit. The first is I would deny the premise that, and of course I disagree with Baron Blue, that monarchy is inherently conservative and that republics or democracies are inherently liberal. I deny that premise entirely. I think you can very clearly see throughout history liberal monarchies such as that of Joseph II of Austria, Friedrich II of Prussia, Catherine II of Russia, I believe it was Charles III of Spain, or for example, Victor Emmanuel II, I believe it was, Risorgimento of Italy. And of course you have conservative republics such as the Republic of Florence, Republic of Venice, the Roman Republic, and then the what was the second point you made again at the end?
Well, I guess the first point was that, like legal positivism doesn't just happen under the rule of law, but can also happen under systems that would not really work in accordance with the rule of law. By the way, I agree with you that like you do not need to be a republic to be liberal. That being said, I think my second point was that if you kind of look at the scholastic tradition, you will see some developments later on in writers like Suarez that point into the direction of the rule of law, especially with the emphasis he puts on custom as one of the origins of law.
Okay. So I think custom. I don't think custom is an absolute. And again, I would say that since man is made in the image of God, it is best that he reflect this in all possible ways, especially considering when you look into what Aristotle says about the state, it's foundationally based upon the family. Well, both in God and in the family, we see a hierarchy wherein there is the father. And so this would be more along the Carlist tradition, but wherein the king is the father of the nation is sort of a family unit. And also this would get into, I don't really agree with Suarez or Bellarmine that much on these points of where authority comes from. I would say I think that Filmer is correct, and I think Filmer is reflected in Leo the 13th. I think foundationally, king has his authority immediately from God and has always had it immediately from God. And that this also is the case with the lesser forms of governance by concomitants, based upon the fact that there is a hierarchy in governance, right, as Aristotle and Aquinas say, where monarchy is the highest form of government. And so these are lower forms of government, but they are not exempt from the fact that their heads also have their authority immediately from God. But as monarchy is the highest form of government, it is because it is reflective of our nature, which is itself reflective of God's nature. And so this would, of course, this would get into Filmer's argument, which is more of a historical and theological argument, but I think it within the Carlist tradition, it's more immediately presented as a philosophical argument.
Right. I guess my point would ultimately be that I am much more on this side within our own Catholic tradition, on the side of someone like Suarez or Bellarmine. But like in a wider tradition, I do think that there's some clear utility in something like the common law. I do think there is something to be said about the sort of positive inclinations of the sort of inherent goodness of like law that isn't really guided by like the sovereign ruler, but rather sort of arises naturally out of spontaneous order, if you will. Simply because such kind of law would very much reflect the realities of interactions and relations within the society. And I think this is also, if we're looking at the sort of Whig tradition and a thinker who's cited by both conservatives and liberals, this is also a kind of argument that you will find in, let's say, Edmund Burke. Oh, by the way, Gonzalo Santos asks us our thoughts on Ye 2024. So I don't know if you wanted to answer to this, Trendy, or if anyone wants to say something on Ye 2024.
Yes, I hope he goes DEFCON 3 and BTFOs, the Democrats, and yeah. And also, Kayak, you're wrong. We're gonna have a tradition. Okay, once Kanye gets into office, he's gonna be our king. So
Funny.
So yeah, well, yeah. What do you think of this sort of idea that sort of custom-based law and law that kind of manifests out of like a spontaneous order, as F.A. Hayek would phrase it, that this would sort of trace more of the information available in society than just sort of direct commands and like direct legislations by a king?
Well, you can't even have rules or explicit rules, right? Like literal like statements that are in texts or in orders. They can't even be rules without a background of implicit rules that the community follows, right? There needs
Right.
to be some regularities in there. Like suppose that take tennis, right? It's even though there's no explicit rule that you can't hit the ball 2 kilometers into the air, it's an implicit rule in the game, right? And if you ask enough questions, right, about is this permissible, is that permissible, if the game didn't have these things as implicit rules, if there wasn't just an implicit like recognition that you weren't supposed to hit the ball 2 kilometers into the air, you weren't supposed to randomly start going into the crowd and beating people up with a racket, the game wouldn't be tennis, right? In order for these rules to even be intelligible, there needs to be this nexus of habits of the community that plays the game. And that's going to be the same way with the rules imposed by a government. Unless there are a nexus of habits to fall to like do such and such, right? The rules will be unintelligible. And we see this as a reality if you look at like late 20th century attempted third world democracies. In all these cases where they try to set up a democracy in, say, Iraq, because it lacks the background that's necessary to make these rules intelligible, right? It's necessary to make them have the significance that they do within the community. You need to have the right background in the community. Iraq didn't have that, and it just the attempted democracy just didn't work. And the same thing will go for a monarchy, right? If you want to introduce a monarchy without, not on the basis of law, but on the basis of just an usurper, right? Taking over America or whatever, and just like throwing out the Constitution. Well, you're still going to have the background of American constitutional democracy, a constitutional republic that we have. The actual community everybody will still have the same habits that they did beforehand. And
right.
If you were to impose all these rules, they wouldn't be followed. There would just be it would just like go into chaos, right? Especially if you look at like local levels. You just can't impose a monarchy on America without a tradition. And this is really the problem with all these like weird reactionary ideologies. They proclaim themselves, they try to justify themselves on the basis of tradition without any tradition. There's
so
yeah, that's certainly a problem, especially since yeah, sure, Trendy, you go first.
Oh, I was going to say, I think tradition is kind of, I think it's kind of a meme. For Julius Caesar, there was no tradition. at that point, the tyrants of Rome were all temporary.
And how did the Roman Empire go? Like, what happened in it? Was there like respect for rule of law in Rome, or was there just like constant assassinations of emperors, constant
I mean, if the
corruption?
implication is that there's more rule of law in Republican America, which
Well, America doesn't have a functioning rule of law anymore. But the thing is that
well, okay, so
but
the
you
end of the
don't
law,
implement
the
a
law
rule.
is
The
not an
point that
end.
we're making,
The law
the point that
is
we're
not
making
an
is that you
end.
can't implement rule of law. Like, rule of law isn't something that you impose by legislation. You need a background of practices within the community, right?
Okay, yeah, sure. So, but again, upon what is that based? Is it based upon man? No. Now, it's true that it's natural. Virtue is natural. Man tends towards the good, but we are fallen creatures, and we cannot climb Jacob's ladder on our own. We have to be pulled up. Which is the issue, for example, with Confucius, or Aristotle. You know, their virtue ethics is true partially. You can't do it without divine assistance. Of course, I don't think Aristotle really thought that you couldn't do it without divine assistance, but I think I don't know if he would have accepted the same thing we accept about the supernatural order. But this is why I think the legalists have a very good critique of Confucius and of the Confucians, because man often does not, because he has fallen, he does not build himself up, right? He wastes away, and so he needs to be pulled up by the state. The state needs to be pulled up by what? By the church. Okay, so.
Well, wait, but how is okay? In what respect is this not also an argument against what you're saying? How is this not also an argument against monarchy?
In what regards?
Who runs a monarchy?
A king.
And what is a king?
A man.
There you go.
Yeah.
This is
correct.
Your argument. Like,
I'd never
the point
said
that we're
that
fallen
monarchy was a
creatures is
perfect
just
form of
it's just
government.
a
So
problem for
okay,
all.
so this is not really relevant, because no one's ever. I mean, if anyone here came into the assumption that governance is in a vacuum, then they came in with the wrong understanding of what our real situation is. Which, if anything, it's the liberals who come in with that understanding. I don't come in with that understanding. I came in with the presupposition that divine aid is absolutely necessary for peace. Because what does our Lord say? He says, "My peace I give you, my peace I leave you, not as the world gives it, but as I giveth it." Okay.
Divine aid can be given to a liberal government as well as a monarchy, right?
Okay, so this has to do with, again,
Like, I don't understand how this is an argument for monarchy.
when you have liberty of law such that you can do anything you want with no consequence, save that it interrupts the quote unquote rule of law, whatever that means, then you can have people going around sodomizing each other, and there's no consequences whatsoever because it doesn't interrupt the quote unquote rule of law.
Yeah,
There's
it
not-
does. Do you?
Well,
What are
okay,
laws?
but upon what basis do you justify that? What basis do you justify that?
On rule,
Under
okay.
liberalism.
If you have a strong rule of law, then you could actually make it the case that it's like impossible for the government to legislate the legalization of homosexuality, and there'll be actual protections for that law, right? Because the king or whatever you have in charge doesn't have the power to override. Okay, doesn't have the power to override these laws.
Okay, so you're misunderstanding what I meant by the lawgiver is greater than the law. I was not talking about natural law. I was talking about positive law. Well, civil positive law.
Yeah. Like I'm talking about the civil positive law that you can't, like, if you have a law in place that it's like
But the king is
part
still
of the
bound to the
constitution of
natural
the country
law.
that you can't legalize homosexuality, then
The king is
it would
still
be
bound
like,
to the natural law.
okay, it's bound normatively, but is it bound as in like the king is actually like it's impossible for him to break these and then get away with it? Like, can the king just like get away with it? Does he have like the physical power to do that?
Anyone can get away
would
with
he
it. I don't know what
or
you
would
mean.
he just get like
Anyone can get away with it. I mean, I don't know what that means. I mean, you could have gotten away with
could you have like
sodomizing
a
500 years
king like,
ago when the positive law said that you were to be burned or executed or whatever. You could have gotten away with heresy or something like that. I mean, you can get away with anything in that sense.
well,
So I don't know what the argument is.
so the point is that
I mean, if I'm a gangster in the hood, I can get away with shooting my homeboys. Some dude coming on my homeboy's turf.
which is if you
over
don't
crack
have
cocaine.
if you don't
I don't
have
understand what your point is.
if you don't have the law in charge of an area, like for example, the it's people aren't actually going to follow the rules of the community, right? The
Okay,
rules
so
that have
your
been
argument is
instituted.
not the law. Your argument is enforcement of the law or violence. That's what you're arguing for.
Well, what
Which I thought
my
that was the
argument
entire
is
point. Is
what do you mean
liberalism
by
about
my argument
violence?
is the
Is it
enforcement of the
about
law? Do
violence
you
or
mean
is it
my
about
position, or like that's not an argument? Do you mean like my position is that the law needs to be enforced?
okay? But
My
that
point my
no.
point is that
What
the
I'm saying
law
is that you're not talking about the law as such. You're talking about violence, state violence. You're saying that's what's necessary.
No, you're not understanding what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the law needs to actually be such that that the rulers and the government can't get away with violating it. Like the government needs to be as bound to the law as the citizens are.
Okay. I understand. So, okay.
And so the
Sorry.
problem is that if you have an
Well, actually, I
absolute
would like to
monarchy,
do the
suppose you
wedding.
have a king that's like a big fan of homosexuality. The laws, he's not bound to follow them. He could just get away with changing the civil law code against homosexuality. He could.
No. You're misunderstanding. I never said the king's civil law could go against the natural or divine law. I never said that. It
Oh,
always has to be.
okay. You're conflating. So you're equivocating on modal verbs. When I say can get away with it, I don't mean it would be morally permissible under absolute monarchism for the king to deny or like institute laws that go against natural law. I'm not talking about moral permissibility here.
No, it wouldn't be. It
I'm
wouldn't be
talking about
permissible.
I'm using the alethic modal sense, as in it is not possible that the king could do this. The king can't do this, as in the same sense as a rock can't fall into the sky when I drop it, right?
Okay, so if the enforcement of the law is based on state violence, and the state is the one in control of violence and enforcement of the law, then technically the state can, no matter what form of government it is, conservative or liberal,
Well, we're
reverse
not saying
laws in that
that
sense, in that
we're
regard.
actually
Yes,
not.
it can. It has happened before. It happens right now.
Not
as we're
always. You
speaking.
can have in a ideal liberal government, you would
See, this
not
is
have
my
the state. You would not have the state be the only instrument of the law, right? Like
if
for
you're
example,
speaking
taking
about a
America,
utopia,
right?
that is absurdity because utopias are impossible, save in the end times. Right?
Well,
And again,
America actually was like this, so I don't understand what your point is.
I would deny that, but
we used to have, right, in our Constitution, and it was actually recognized for quite a while until like Andrew Jackson, basically, that if the government, right, if it were to in some way like violently like go against the Constitution or whatever, that there'd be the possibility of a militia's uprising. That was what the Second Amendment was originally for, right? It wasn't even about like it's arguably wasn't even about guns. It was about having the possibility of organizing militias to regulate the government, right? The point of classical liberalism is that the government is itself bound to the law, right? It's
Okay, well, I think
and if you look, remember, you have to realize this: a country is made out of not just the government but the people in it. In fact, the people in most countries vastly are greater than the government, and they have way more power than the government, and the government can't really do anything if everybody's working against them.
Okay, I think I see the issue. You're conflating the natural law and positive civil law.
I'm not. You're conflating
are.
different senses of modal groups.
No. I'm trying to talk. Okay, so let me give you an example. There's a king. He has decided to charge his citizens with, let's say, 80% taxes, such that they begin to starve. Now, this is against the natural law, and so his nobles rise up and depose him. Now, there's nothing in saving maybe some of the Stuart branch of sort of a non-juring thought among the jurists and theologians of England. But again, I would say that that's more characteristic of liberalism. For example, the Febronians, the enlightened despots, like the ones I listed before. Again, that's characteristic of liberalism, not of a traditional form of government, which is, in fact, where you have a I don't know what you would. I can't think of the term right now, but subsidiarity. That was what I was going to say. You have subsidiarity, and I mean, I don't really know how else to put
By
it.
traditional form of government, it like seems that you're just talking about English the English
no
monarchy, right?
all
In the late Middle Ages, like that's exclusively what you're talking about. In almost every other monarchy, right? You either had the king or the nobles were just like not bound to the rule of law. Like there was almost no rule of law for the king or the nobles. Like the nobility could just get away with anything. And in the case with England, right, that was just like a proto-classical liberal government.
Okay, well, I would deny the major premise. I don't think that's actually true. In fact, I can bring you many, many, many cases where kings, emperors, nobility were punished. And again, this was brought about by who? But the moral force of the church. Henry IV, Frederick II. Those are the major ones. Right?
Correct. So yeah,
or for example,
in the case of the church,
the Guelphs and the Ghibellines.
The ecclesial law was actually the backbone of the rule of law in like England and in other parts of Europe. Francis Fukuyama actually argues for this extensively. But I have to get dinner. Franz will destroy him. Okay, and then I'll be back.
You know, it's pretty late on my end, so I'm about to probably end the stream, but like, all right, so Dandy, I would say one of the things I would like to add to this conversation is that if you look at kings and similar lawgivers, then one of my problems would be that, you know, when we're applying law to a society, we kind of have to take into account the regularities that already exist in that society. Like the laws are there to protect social order, right? So, in a case in which the laws do not take into account the regularities of that social order, they are in fact disruptive to the social order. Now, the problem with like law by a king but by a king who operates in a way that you imagine it at the very least, in my opinion, is that this would lead us to a situation where essentially we kind of stumble upon the problem of limited knowledge that human beings, by their nature, have like a very sort of narrow frame of knowledge that they can operate with and perform actions within. So usually this is why I think the emphasis on custom as central to law is important, because here we very much have already are certain regularities and behaviors implicit in the order of things, and just trying to sort of clarify within our language the rules which already sort of apply to society in order to preserve society. Now, this is much more difficult in the case of a legislator who's trying to sort of shape society and according to his will from top to bottom, where the limits of knowledge can really sort of mess with that sort of thing.
Right, but do you think that this would always be bad for let's say I became the king of America, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the custom now in America is such that you and I would be against it, right? And I would be tempted to enact a law which would be opposed. Now, if I had a moral duty to enact that law and it was against custom, would I have the right to do it?
So there are some cases, and like even some like Kayak would agree with you there, where like legislation, sort of top-down legislation, can be used as a corrective of various parts of
Right.
the social order. However, I do think that like if we're taking this as more as a corrective, and if we're suddenly regarding this as sort of our main instrument of legislating and interacting with the social order, then we're going to get into this is going to be end up being a blunder, which sort of leads down the road to serfdom, to use that particular phrasing.
Well, okay, so what I'm
So
trying to
really,
get at
it
is
is
that the law is not an end, it is a means. And the end is naturally happiness, supernaturally beatitude. So again, I'm trying to bring into this not the naturalistic preconceptions of the liberals, but the supernatural presuppositions of the Catholic faith, the great chain of being, Jacob's ladder. And I'm trying to get away from this idea of man doing things on his own. Custom defines the law is an end, the law. But the whole thing here is, again, I'm trying to show if we reason that God exists and God is the foundation of all things, then the lawgiver must be greater than the law because God is the ultimate lawgiver. And since man is made in the image of God, and we know this from natural reason, since man is intellectual and God also must be intellectual, then in society, the lawgiver must be greater than the law. Now, that's not to say that custom does not play a part. It absolutely does play a part. Just like subsidiarity plays a part. Okay, mixed government is usually the best. Okay, I don't advocate for an absolute monarchy, because I think that a monarchy where you have nobility, or, for example, in oftentimes elective monarchies are very good. I think that works very well. But I think when we get down into the weeds with, well, this happens because of this, humans are corrupt, or this is all sort of it's incidental. We know that humans are corrupt. But again, I'm trying to avoid the idea of the state as something which corrupts absolutely, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in fact, I'm sure you know who said that.
Yes, of course.
And he was and I would actually agree with both, probably you and him, in terms of the state should not be as all-encompassing as it is today. But I don't think that the traditional order, which I advocate for, at least I don't know about Baron Blue, that I advocate for, I don't think it's all-encompassing. I don't want the state to be all-encompassing, right? Like this, something that Mussolini or Gentile would have imagined. I don't think that the state is the end-all be-all, and that we're in this sort of animated spirit and of revolution, wherein the state is marching on and on and on. I think that's what liberalism is. So perhaps your understanding of liberalism is a little different. Maybe it's more in something like the post-revolutionary tradition. You mentioned Burke, so I imagine it's more something like that. But I think that's a derivation from what liberalism really is, which is revolutionary. I kind of went off on a tangent, but
Right. Yeah, so my fear kind of comes in different parts. On the one hand, I do think that there is a real fear that like power tends to corrupt absolutely, and therefore we should always be wary of the legislative powers of rulers. I think there's also something to be said about your argument of man being made in the image of God and reflecting the lawgiver, because it seems to me that such an argument wouldn't necessarily straight up lead to arguments for traditional order as you're describing it. In fact, it seems to me that with an argument like this, we could very much say that the way that individual interaction leads to patterns of behavior within society. That this is a way in which man participates in lawmaking capacities, and in a way becomes more like God, in a sense, that there is a real reflection of the image of God in that. And in fact, I think St. Thomas would make an argument like this. I think a final problem comes from, I do agree that, like the authority, be it of law or of anything else, is there for like human happiness in a sort of eudaimonic sense of things. I also do think that there is a sort of problem with the term. Once look at antiquity, then we kind of use state almost as a synonym for something like society. Like in antique societies, like the polis used to be like very sort of cosmological, all-encompassing societies and political orders. Whereas I would say that, like, especially with the way of the word or the term state is used nowadays, as state sort of be with term government, the state has like a very limited sphere, and the sort of like assisting powers that help man to fulfill his ends, they are not just the powers of the government, they're the powers of local communities, they're the powers of my parents, of my friends, they're the powers of the parish I go to. They're like all these daily institutions that I interact with, which have sort of contributed more to my own moral development than any governmental power ever could have. So I do in fact think that the sort of like overemphasization of on the authority of the government and the state within this whole more like scheme can be kind of erroneous. And in fact, if you look at the practical reality of it, a bit detrimental even.
All right, so I would just say law is something which is inherently relational. And so the reason why I don't think, again, I would go back to what Aristotle says about governance coming from, or rather the state essentially having its primitive form in the family, and how this is reflective of monarchy. And again, how that reflects divinity. But I would also say that simply the king is, again, bound by natural law and divine law. Now, as to local communities, and the rule of law, so custom establishing the rule of law, but then the rule of law is an absolute because the state is bound to it. So is the local community. And so at that point, it becomes a sort of monster, Frankenstein's monster, if you will. Because you would have to admit that there are customs, which are both good and bad, but which arrive because of middle management, because of bureaucracy, not because of a national sort of state, but because of local rule, which is, again, what's being encouraged here. But when we look at oftentimes bureaucracy is not the result of a absolute monarch. This is the result of smaller governments. Okay, so, and this really more has to do with centralization of government, but the custom, for example, where I live 200 years ago is not the same as it is now. But the custom now is you need warrants, you need permits, you need licenses to do very simple things, to hunt, to make food and sell it. Yes, but again, if we're talking about...
There's an entire list of useless laws, which I think ought to be abolished.
Well, yes, I agree. Most of these ought to be abolished. But I don't think that's...
I would even go so far as to like include under laws that ought to be abolished something like child labor laws, anti-discrimination laws, minimum wage laws, these kinds of regulations. I think there's a whole body of laws which is essentially not beneficial to social developments at all, is really just a sort of government overreach into the private sphere, and, well, happens to be essentially quite useless.
Right. A
But
lot of
continue.
these are more a result of progressivist ideas, but again, these progressivist ideas I don't think can be detached from their liberal origins, wherein you have a sort of expansion of the power base and thus an expansion of governance. I'm thinking mainly of these sort of Whigs in Britain, the Jacksonians in America, and I think if you were to look at, for example, at a Hamiltonian model in America versus a Jacksonian model. Now, one might argue that the Hamiltonian model is on paper, it's more absolutist and that should be opposed. Right, but a Jacksonian model leads to all sorts of problems. And so you need something. And in terms of here, what the state was to be, whether it be a confederation or a centralized government, I think that the middle position leads to more centralization than either ends of the spectrum. I think the middle position, the synthesis, leads to far more centralization in the end. And I think it's the case. This is also the case where I think that the federal model is so despicable. Because, and again, there's less. I would just go back. I mean, I've kind of gotten off to the point where I'm sort of off in the woods trying to find my way back. But again, I would just go back there. There's hierarchy is natural in humans. Government is natural as well. And so the government should be thus that there's a hierarchy. And again, the rule of law that you're appealing to, is it positive or is it natural? I would say, yes, there's law above all men, which we are all bound to, but then there's the civil positive law, right, which can be changed. But custom is definitely important, but you cannot let custom override man's natural ends being happiness or his supernatural ends. And again, by happiness, we don't mean whatever makes me feel good, right? Of course, I don't know, just for whoever's watching. But what I was trying to get out of the whole thing with the Whigs and Jacksonian democracy is, if you will, and really the sort of idea of the mass of the people. Well, what does that lead to? That leads to a dictatorship of the proletariat, because essentially the people can never have power upon them. You know, they can never just enact power alone. That's impossible. You know, this is why communism is just not, it's not possible. It's a total fantasy. Humans are naturally hierarchical. And so whenever you have these sorts of loosening of disciplines, liberating people, you have to have something managing them, and thus you also have a centralization. And so whenever you have the people freed, the government grows. It gets bigger, it gets bloated. Whereas if the people are regulated, well regulated, you know, then they will not need this massive government. And thus really, while on paper, we today have more rights than people did 1,000 years ago, in practice, we don't at all. We have less rights. We can't go out and just, you know, sell bread or whatever. I mean, people back then couldn't hunt, but that was for a different reason. We don't have common land. You know, we don't have where just any cows can graze and all that. I mean, we don't. except for, certain parts maybe. But again, even then you need things like permits. You can't just go out and do it. So essentially what I'm arguing for is that this idea of liberty really is topsy-turvy, because on when you put pen to paper, things don't play out like they do in your mind. And so, we can theorize all we want about how great it would be if everyone could just do whatever they want, but that's a mess in reality. And so what I'm trying to get beyond merely the thought of freedom versus what that actually entails. And I guess I could give a sort of illustration. You have two people from two different times. One lives on a farm. They are bound to that farm for the whole of their life, but they will never go hungry. They will never be kicked off their land. They will have a wife, and they will have many children, and they will die in the church. Now you have someone who can leave the land, go into the city, fornicate, have no children at all, and die alone outside the church. Now, one is more free in a sense, and the other is more free in another sense. There's true liberty and false liberty. And I think with that illustration, I'm going to say goodnight, because I want to do other things than debate all night. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah, there's a lot of things I could try to respond to here, but it's also getting a little bit late for me. Maybe we should continue this discussion at some other point. I don't know. But yeah, for all the remaining viewers who are here listening to the New Anime Writers live stream, I hope that you guys enjoyed it, even though there were like some difficulties, and well, most of us are new to streaming. Anyways, thanks for joining us, to both the Blue Baron, who isn't here anymore, the original anime Rightist, to Trendy, who provided some interesting arguments tonight as well, and of course to Pat. And thanks for everyone for tuning in, and good night and God bless.
Good night. God bless.